Black British history long predates the Windrush generation who arrived after World War II. Today I'm going to be talking about their history in this country, but concentrating on Essex, the local county here. Now, the Roman army had a legion that was raised in Mauritania, North Africa, and that was based here in this country. We're not certain how many of them were what today we would call Arabs, or whether they were sub-Saharan Africans. But either way, it looks as if some actually left descendants here. A research project in northern England identified a rare West African Y chromosome in a group of men from Yorkshire who share a rare surname that dates back to the 14th century. Now, although they have a typically European appearance, they do have a very unusual Y chromosome, and it's been worked out that this dates back to an African man living in England at least 250 years ago. So probably this was a Roman soldier who perhaps stayed on, as many did when their period of service in the Legion was finished. A genealogist actually traced their history too, and found that they had a common ancestor in the 18th century. But, as I say, the African DNA lineage dates back much earlier. There's also a cluster of people in North Wales with a similar unusual genetic pattern. And it's also worth mentioning that one of the Roman emperors, Septimus Severus, who was born in Libya, actually finished his life here and is buried in York. So perhaps there are many more others who came over with the Roman army and then left descendants here. Not many family historians are back to Roman times though, so I think the next thing that we will look at are the Tudors. In 1511, a picture of a tournament in Westminster shows a black trumpeter, and we actually know his name. It was John Blanca. This is probably a bit of an in-joke because it sounds like John White, Blanc, or the Spanish Blanco. We know quite a lot about him because he comes up in Henry VIII's account books. He asked for a pay rise and he got it. And he also was given a very, very rich robe when he got married. We do know there's a whole book about Black Tudors, and Dr. Miranda Kaufman has done her thesis on them. So we know that there were quite a few in Tudor and Stuart times in England. About the same time, in 1567, various lists of what were called aliens, i.e. foreigners, those who were born overseas, was made in the city of London, and there are a number of people there. They were called at that time blackamoors, and again we're not certain whether they were what today we would know as Arabs, or whether they were sub-Saharan Africans. Now, the English slave trade is quite a complicated subject. In 1562, John Hawkins made the first of what he hoped to be slave trading voyages to Africa. They were not very successful. The Portuguese and the Spanish had a long-standing slave trade there. And so John Hawkins thought he'd muscle in on it, but it was a lot more complicated than he thought. It didn't really work out very well. Most of the black people in this country at that time seem to have been captured from the Spanish in sort of raids on their ships. From 1618 onwards, there were various companies who were formed to trade with Africa. Most of them were trading in respectable goods like gold, ivory, oil, and things like that. But some of them started to dabble in, if you like, the slave trade. In 1672, the Royal African Company was founded to regulate the trade. They really didn't want people muscling on it. They didn't want freelancers. So the Royal African Company was given a monopoly. Some years later, in 1698, the monopoly ended and it was a free-for-all. England became a very, very powerful slave trading nation. It built up colonies in the Caribbean and in North America because, of course, America was under British rule until the American War of Independence. For over a century, there was a lot of trade with West Africa, what was called the triangular trade, and some of the people did not go from West Africa to the Caribbean and North America, but came here. We have evidence of a fair number who started families here, who lived here, and they came perhaps with sea captains. We're not quite certain. They came as servants from the Caribbean. Anyway, so that's where a fair number of people in this country started out. And then in 1807, the British abolished their slave trade. So that's a brief outline of the slave trade in Britain. And as I say, it resulted in a lot of people being brought here. I'm now going to look at Essex specifically. I have a database of black people in this country, which I started, I started about 20 years ago. It dates back to the 1500s and goes on to the beginning of the 19th century. And on my database, I have 79 people that I can identify as black who were in Essex. Someone in the Essex Record Office in Chelmsford made a list, but we know that's not complete. There is a lot more to be discovered. The first one I found is in 1579, when a chap called Thomas Parker, described as a certain dark man, was buried in Rayleigh. Now this raises one of the big problems of sorting out the history of black people in this country, is simply that the everyday word was black. The official word was originally Negro, and then it became coloured or of colour, but the word that everybody locally used was black, and they didn't use it just of people of African origin. They also used it of people from the Indian subcontinent, and they used it of very, very dark-skinned native Britons too. You do not very often have any idea where the person came from. So although Thomas Parker was called a certain dark man, we don't absolutely know whether he was black or not. The next one, in 1611, is a lot clearer. John Barksaw was baptized in Leighton, and he is described as a black. So at that point, we do know that that person was almost certainly from sub-Saharan Africa. And then a bit later, in 1686, a girl called Judith from Barbados, the daughter of Tim and Maria, was baptized in Writtle. So those are the very early ones. All I know is that most of them lived perfectly ordinary lives. A lot of them got married to local people and raised families. So there's a great deal more work to be done. Most of those here seem to have been servants, but actually that's how most people started out their lives. The white population were servants too at the beginning of their working lives. And like them, a lot of the black people, when they married, they left service to start another job. Many became shopkeepers because, having worked in a household, a large household, they knew how to deal with shopkeepers, they knew how to buy things. However, there were also a number who served in the armed forces. This is a picture of an army band who were playing in Vauxhall Gardens, a popular place of entertainment in London. Because of their appearance, black people often led regiments when they were marching through towns, when they were going on parade somewhere. Now, quite a few of them, like the one here, were drummers. And one of the really interesting things about that is that in an army regiment, it was the job of the drummer to flog people when they were sentenced to being punished in this way. A Norfolk newspaper at one point said that to see a white man being flogged by a black soldier was a very disagreeable sight. But the army had no problem with this. You were the drummer, that was your job. They also served at sea. The best known black person at sea is Olaudah Equiano. He wrote his biography called The Interesting Narrative. He had been purchased as a child by a British naval officer. Eventually, he earned enough to buy his own freedom. He settled in Britain and became involved in the abolition movement. That is what he's best known for today. But in fact, as his autobiography shows, he spent most of his life in the Navy. He went on a lot of expeditions. For example, he went to the Arctic on an expedition to try to discover the Northwest Passage. In many ways, that's more interesting about shipboard life than about the abolition movement. Now, if you were in the Royal Navy and you were black, you could, like white sailors, apply to enter the Greenwich Hospital when you were too old to work or became disabled. However, this wasn't open to merchant seamen. This is Joseph Johnson. He was a merchant seaman who was disabled, so he couldn't work, but he couldn't enter Greenwich Hospital. He lived in London, but he often went to Romford on market days because he made his living by begging. And his particular trick was to sing patriotic songs. He had on his head a model of Nelson's flagship, the Victory. So when he bowed to people in thanks for them giving him money, it looked as if the ship was sailing through the sea. Now, as I say, we know he went to Romford Market, where he did very well, and he must have walked along the Romford Road and sung at points along there. So all the towns on the Romford Road would have seen Joseph Johnson pass through. Here is another sailor. He has just landed. He is very, very rich because he has all his back wages and he may have prize money from what he has earned capturing other ships. These two ladies are going to get him very, very drunk, and then they are going to rob him. And as we see, these two ladies working together, one is black, one is white. Crime is an equal opportunity employer. Now, we don't know all the black people who appeared in the local courts in Essex. If we look at the Old Bailey online, it's quite easy there. That's a sort of transcript of all the trials. And you can pick out black people there usually. But there remains to be a lot of work done on the local records in Essex. Another black person that Essex people might have seen were fighters, pugilists. Here we have Tom Molyneux, who was an American fighter. His second is Bill Richmond, a retired pugilist who by this time was acting as organising matches. He also taught boxing in his pub in London. Now, bare-knuckle fighting was disapproved of. It was in many places illegal, and the Essex marshes were so isolated that many illegal fights took place here. One other itinerant person that people might have seen performing here was a woman called Amelia Harlequin. That was her professional name. She was born in Jamaica. She was the child of house slaves there. And her particular peculiarity, if you like, was that she had albinism. Her skin was white, but her features were African. Her master sent her to England because he wanted to earn money through her. She very, very quickly, when she grew up, got away from him, got away from the people who owned her, and exhibited herself for her own benefit. And the last sighting of her at the end of the 18th century is in West Ham, where she caused an enormous fuss because at this time everybody was waiting for Napoleon to invade. There were people marching everywhere, there were soldiers, there were volunteers. And then late one night, two men walking round West Ham saw a huge crowd gathering. Now either they thought the French have invaded, or they thought this is a rebellion, because wanting to set up a republic was something that was very much in the news then. When they got closer, they actually found that this was Amelia with another man and her child. And she had actually been waiting to exhibit herself to all these people. About 100 turned up, all with a penny, because they wanted to see her. That's the last sighting that we have of her. But it's an indication of the way that a lot of black people, performers, people like Joseph Johnson, the boxers, Amelia, were familiar sights to people, even if they didn't actually have many black people living locally. One who did, however, live in Essex was a woman called Harriet Woodley. She was buried in Little Parndon in May 1767. She was a housekeeper, and she is entered in the parish records there as a Negro woman, so we know that she was someone of sub-Saharan African origin. A memorial to her was erected by John Woodley. He wrote on there that it was a grateful remembrance of her faithful discharging of her duty with the utmost attention and integrity in the service of his late mother, Mrs. Bridget Woodley, to whom she belonged during her life, and after her death to her daughter, Mrs. Mary Parsons. The wording of this raises a few problems. What exactly does it mean by belong to? Did they think that she was a slave? Did she think she was a slave? Or was it simply because other occasionally white servants say that they belonged to someone? Was it simply that she worked for them? We don't actually know. The problem is that the status of black people in England was a bit ambiguous. It was always difficult to know whether people in England were enslaved or not, whether black people were enslaved. It wasn't until 1765 that Granville Sharp, a Londoner, began to bring cases to the courts of people who had been brought over from the colonies in order to challenge their right to consider them as still as enslaved. The first case he brought was in 1765, and it was the case of Jonathan Strong, who had been brought from the Caribbean. Then it seems that he had demanded his freedom, and his master had beaten him up very badly and apparently left him to die. Granville Sharp rescued him. He got him treated by his brother, who was a surgeon, and when the man had healed, they found him a job. A short while later, his master saw him and wanted him back. The matter went to court. It was sort of resolved, but not with any kind of definitive ruling. The magistrate who was sitting at the Court of London simply dismissed the case. He did not have any sort of legal ruling on this. So Granville Sharp tried to bring other cases, and finally he brought the case of James Somerset, who had been brought from America to the court in 1772. And Lord Mansfield, then the most important, the highest judge in the land, ruled that slavery had never existed in England and Wales since medieval times. While black people were in this country, they were free, but if they returned to their original homes, their original places, they could once more be enslaved. So that was the judgment that settled the matter for once and for all, or at least so he thought. There's another footnote to this. Lord Mansfield himself had in his household a girl of mixed race. She was his great-niece, the daughter of his nephew, who was a sea captain. Dido Elizabeth Bell was brought up by Lord Mansfield. She lived in Kenwood House, and she was brought up with another cousin who was orphaned. The cousin who was white and orphaned, married a titled man. She was a legitimate girl. Dido was illegitimate. So although she was brought up in great comfort, she was actually, she then married a man, an estate manager. So this was about right for her social status. There's a film about her called Belle. The film is factually quite inaccurate. This is one of the fun games that those of us who work in Black British history play, spotting the errors. But it does show her social background and the kind of life that she led. I mentioned a bit earlier that Granville Sharp was bringing cases to the courts to challenge the rights of masters who brought slaves to this country. He was also involved in the abolition movement to try to abolish slavery altogether. He brought the case of the slave ship Zong to the courts in 1783. It was actually Olida Equiano who told Granville Sharp about it. This is a very, very odd, very murky case. A ship called the Zong was carrying slaves, and then it was claimed they started to run out of water and food on board. Many of the slaves became sick, and so the captain had them thrown overboard, because if they died, that was the end of it. But if they had drowned, if they were still alive, then he thought he could claim on the insurance. So that was one of the really big cases that was given a great deal of publicity. I'm not quite certain how it ended. I don't know whether there was actually a payment. No one does seem to know. But anyway, that one aroused a huge amount of public interest and hatred and brought up animosity against the slave trade. In that year, the Quakers, the Society of Friends, formed a committee against the slave trade, and that was where the abolition movement in Britain began. They were very strong in Essex, the Quakers. Elizabeth Fry, her brother Samuel Gurney, they were all involved in this. In fact, Samuel Gurney gave a great deal of money. He funded a lot of the abolition movement. They lived out at West Ham, near Upton Park, and you can still visit West Ham Park, which was where the Samuel Gurney lived. A few years later, in 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the African Slave Trade was founded. This actually appears to be the first society of its kind in the world, and it was the forerunner of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, which was formed in 1839. This has now become Anti-Slavery International. This is the oldest anti-slavery organisation in the world, and it had its roots here in Britain. In 1807, the British slave trade was abolished. Of course, there were people who evaded it, but in fact that was quite a serious point, to make the point that the slave trade was unacceptable. It took another 20-odd years until the abolition of slavery in the British colonies was achieved in 1834. Now, the knowledge that black people were free in Britain brought a lot of Americans to the United Kingdom, even before the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in British colonies. One of those who came was a man called Joseph Freeman. He was a slave in New Orleans. He settled in eastern England in the 1840s. The 1871 census records him and his wife with their 6 children in Chelmsford. He is buried in the old nonconformist cemetery in Chelmsford, and the gravestone reads, "Erected by his Christian friends to the memory of Joseph, once a slave in New Orleans, who escaped to England and became also a free man in Christ. He was employed for several years at the London Road Iron Works until his death at the age of 45 on the 28th of November, 1875. Reader, have you been made from the slavery of sin?" Joseph left America before 1850. But there was a whole wave of fugitive slaves who came after 1850 because of the Fugitive Slaves Act in the United States. Officials were required to arrest people suspected of being a runaway slave. Suspected slaves could not ask for a jury trial or testify on their own behalf. Any person aiding a runaway slave with food or shelter was subject to 6 months imprisonment and a £1,000 fine. a $1,000 fine, officers who captured a fugitive slave were entitled to a bonus or promotion for their work. And it was no longer possible for those who had escaped from the south to the north to be claimed to be free, because this act applied to the whole country. The north had to return people back to enslavement. Even those who had escaped before then to Canada didn't feel themselves safe, because there were slave catchers out. People who wanted the bonus, who wanted the promotion, set out to hunt them. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 brought a whole wave of fugitives to Britain. Among them, the best known are Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown. They are the best known, and they toured the country. Both of them spoke in Essex. William Wells Brown's daughters, Clarissa and Josephine, were educated in France and London. Clarissa was briefly a school teacher in Burton in Essex. Josephine also became headmistress of a school in Plumstead in South London. Josephine returned to the United States. We're not certain whether she came back later. The major problem is a name like Josephine Brown is too common. However, we do know a lot more about Clarissa. She didn't really take to being a school teacher. She was a governess for a bit. Then she married a Swiss watchmaker who died. Then she married a classical musician, and she went on the stage with him. She sang. Not certain yet whether she performed in Essex or not. That's one of the things that remains to be discovered. Other fugitive slaves were William and Ellen Craft. They appeared on the same stage very often as William Wells Brown, so they'd have appeared in Essex too. Their method of escape was quite extraordinary. Ellen was the daughter of her master and his slave, and she could pass as white, so she dressed herself up as a young man in order to so that she didn't have to write anything. She bandaged her arm and pretended that her hand hurt, because she was, like most slaves, illiterate. And then her future husband accompanied her as her slave. So they travelled openly from Georgia to the north and to freedom as a young invalid man and his valet. Another fugitive slave who had an extraordinary method of escape was Henry Box Brown. He was a slave in Virginia. His wife and his 3 children were sold, and that decided him to leave and come to Britain. He escaped. No, first of all, actually, he didn't intend to come to Britain. First of all, he escaped to the north by being nailed up in a crate and posted from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia. It took 27 hours. He thought at several times he would die. He was upside down at one stage. He started out speaking on abolition, and then the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was passed in America, and it was at that point he decided to come to Britain. Here, he started out speaking on abolition. He toured the country. He spoke in Essex, like William Wells Brown, who incidentally didn't like him very much. They may have both been slaves, but they didn't necessarily get on. He married a Cornish school teacher and then started to speak about other subjects. And finally, he moved into mesmerism, which was what hypnotism was called then, and magic. I think he's the first black man to have a magic act on the British stage. Now, although he worked mainly in the north and the west country, like all the others, he visited Essex a few times. What can we do to find out more about the history of black people in Britain, and specifically in your local area? Like I said, my database is not complete. There's a lot more we can do locally. One of the ways of looking for people is through censuses. There has been a census in this country since 1801, every 10 years. Now, from 1851, the birthplace of each person was required, not their race. This raises a lot of problems. It was only in 1991 that people were required to give their ethnic background. So you do find people born in the various British colonies, but we have no indication of their colour. The British Empire, of course, brought numerous people from the Caribbean, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Africa, and from North America. Now, many of the people from the British colonies were students and returned after their graduation. Others were transient, mainly seamen, but others did settle. Now, I noticed by running through the 1851 census, the birthplaces, that 31 people in Essex were born in Jamaica. We don't know how many of them were white, how many of them were black. Each person would have to be researched separately. The numbers increased for Jamaica and also for all the other British colonies. In the 1901 census in Essex, there are 60 people born in Jamaica, 27 in Bermuda, 16 from Barbados, 13 from British Guiana, 6 Grenada, 4 St. Kitts, 4 from Trinidad, 2 Antigua, 1 St. Lucia, and 1 in Nevis. So all those would have to be sorted out separately because we don't know their ethnicity, only their birthplace. Actually, the best source of information about black British people anywhere are newspapers, because they are the only place where either colour or ethnicity are regularly reported. It doesn't appear very often in official records. From 1900, there are lots of news stories in the Chelmsford Chronicle, but these are mainly to do with disorderly seamen in the docks at Canning Town, which were then in Essex. But there were others, much more respectable people. The Chelmsford Chronicle of the 15th of November 1901 has a story about a middle-class black couple who come from America here and had been living here for about 8 years. Thomas Greathead Harper was a writer, he was a clergyman, and he was then acting as some kind of agent. He had been born in the British colony of Demerara, which is now Guyana, and his wife was an American. Her name was Ella Louise. He had left her with their children. She was living in Leighton at the time, and her husband wanted custody of their children. She said he wasn't giving her enough money to live on, and so she went to court to get an order for him to pay her maintenance. He told her to get a job. He said that her father in Philadelphia was well-to-do, and that her father and her wife and his father were trying to force him to go back to America, which he didn't want to do. We don't know the outcome of this because the magistrates refused to grant her an order, so we don't know what happened. What it does prove, though, is that there were a lot of well-to-do, middle-class black people living in Essex at this time. There's another one. He was the son of a man who had been a governor of the island of St. Vincent, then a British colony in the Caribbean, who had a black wife. They came to Britain about 1860, and this youngest boy became a stockbroker. Now, like all good Londoners, he wanted a nice little place in Essex. So he moved out at various times and lived in various places here before returning to London to go on with stockbroking. It's also worth, while we're talking about famous black people, mentioning Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He was the son of an African student doctor who went back to Africa without realizing his girlfriend was pregnant. He was brought up by her and her family in Croydon. One of his most popular works was Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, which was everywhere. It was really an absolute bestseller. It was performed all over the place, and it is still, I've seen it occasionally in various, sung by local amateur choral societies. So Those people who were music fans in the all over Essex must have heard his work at some time. It wasn't just Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, but I'm just saying that that was his most popular work at the time. And now, moving up to the present day, many people from the colonies came to fight for Britain in the two world wars, in the First and Second World War. Most returned home to their countries, but some stayed. Stephen Bourne is working on their life histories. And then, of course, after 1848, we come to the Windrush generation, which is where my talk ends.